Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Beyond Train podcast. I am your host, Lee Abdal, and I'm so happy that you're here listening to this episode today. If you are new around here, consider subscribing or following the show. If you like what we do here, make sure to comment, subscribe, leave a rating or a review. Sharing is always the best way to help support us. If you would like to support us further, you should consider joining the Beyond Terrain Academy. First and foremost, it is free to join. You do gain access to terrain fundamentals classroom, as well as an introductory course on the true root causes of disease. However, if you do want to go deeper, you can join as a full member to gain access to some exclusive content. Monthly master classes, the Terrain Wellness Club with Jacob Diaz and Alex Zeck, myself, of course. Q&A and discussions, the Terrain Studies Library, deep dive classrooms, things on parasites, lifestyle, movement, etc. You gain access to so much more. A truly unified community, walking along the same path, and some really, really cool discussions. If you pay for the year, you do gain access to a complimentary Catalyst consultation to launch yourself into your terrain-based healing journey, as well as a year-end check-in. Regardless, you should go and join the community because it is free to join and there are tons of free resources. But without further ado, let's get into today's episode. Dr. Kaufman, thank you once again for coming back on the Beyond Train podcast. Nice to see you again.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, Liev.
Of course. So I really wanted to invite you on. You're brilliant. You've shared some amazing thoughts on the train, on natural law, on so many topics. Something I really wanted to pick your brain about was, raising healthy children in the modern world. So I guess maybe to kind of open the floor, where do we start in this conversation of raising healthy children? Because it seems as though it starts far before conception even.
Well, I would definitely agree that planning is key because you want to have a healthy child come out and you want it to be born into a stable family. But I think if we just, take a step to zoom out a little bit, you mentioned in your introduction how I talk about a lot of different topics. And there's an important reason for that. And this is not necessarily something unique about me, although it may be unique that I do this, but it's not because of a unique ability. And this is because we can recognize that the authorities, both not just in government, but in academia, in authorship of the current body of knowledge, there are so many things that are misleading, wrong, fraudulent, etc., that it behooves us to take the responsibility to learn about different aspects related to our lives so that we can, make informed decisions and not be vulnerable to being taken advantage of or misled or harmed by so many things out there that can do that. And of course, if you think about the hierarchy of where that should begin, it makes sense with the family and with raising the next generation to prepare them to carry on that mission and that way of living where you have self-reliance, independence, and responsibility for your actions.
Yeah, amazing. It's funny, when I reflect on my own journey and my kind of healing journey, quote unquote, it came with looking into a vast, a ton of different topics. And it was like building log cabins. I was so interested in that, and carpentry and, homesteading. And, now even when I'm thinking about, my future family here, building a curriculum and what am I going to want to implement and teach my children, beyond even sort of the trivium, quadrivium, I want to implement some arts in there. I want to implement study of poetry and different ideas like that. And I kind of have to come in and learn a lot of that, and take responsibility for that education of myself too, to be able to impart that wisdom. And, but, there's so many different things. And that's, I find, where community helps too, where, I have lots of people in my family who are extremely skilled carpenters that if I ever needed any advice in there, I'm able to go to them. And, hopefully my children can learn from them as well. Right. So that community aspect to offset the burden, responsibility, I suppose, in a way where people can specialize in different things and we could come together. And my wife always says it takes a village to raise a family, so I kind of like that saying.
Yeah, well, there is a lot of wisdom to that, and of course, you can't be a master or purveyor of every single thing, right? What I think it is important to have a level of knowledge and understanding to make you competent, so that when you are working with people, you can either learn from them or you can evaluate if they're doing doing a proper job, right? Which can be just as important because not everybody out there is, self-responsible in the way we might hold our family to as a standard. And we can look at raising children in a lot of different ways. Of course, we could talk about, the educational aspect of it. We could talk about development. We could talk about planning for a family, what are the right ingredients, and we can talk about health of a pregnancy, fertility, and even the birthing process if you like. But all those, obviously it's a lifetime job or responsibility to bring a new life into the world, so there's a lot that goes into it.
Of course. Dr. Kaufman, what are your thoughts on individuals who don't want to have a family? I'm kind of curious on like what your perspective is on that.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think it's important for those people to find out the real reason for each individual as to why that is, because it is in our nature, and obviously the survival of humanity depends on bringing future generations into the world, and especially in the timing of what's going on at present, because, right now we're actually at risk of extinction. And now I know that the information authorities out there talk about an overpopulation crisis and such, like people like Bill Gates. But actually, if you look at what's going on now, the fertility rates and the birth rates are below replacement levels, substantially below replacement levels in most Western countries, including the United States. And this data comes from the CDC. It's not controversial. It's just misreported when it comes to certain elites in the media. But so if we are going to, if we're good people and capable of raising children, which anyone without serious life problems, obviously if you're struggling with addiction, for example, or other severe problems, with your anger and violent behavior, things like that, you should definitely are not ready at that point in your life to have children. But you can go through a process to develop yourself and fulfill that destiny if you are motivated and put in the work to do that. But for everyone else, I mean, it's really important, I think, to maintain our population. And there is a point below which it really does lead to extinction. So, I'm not really exaggerating with what I'm talking about. And, in my opinion, there's been not only a cultural assault on the family trying to discourage um, pregnancy and procreation, but also a, chemical assault that's led to massive fertility issues.
Yeah, absolutely. When I think about like the psychology of, not wanting to do kind of the most fundamental truth that we we know is real, we don't there's no guesswork when it comes to procreation. Um, you know, you mentioned kind of being in a difficult situation overtly, with addiction or anger issues or whatever it may be, and having to kind of put in that great work to be able to get on a path to be able to, pass on some sort of good. And, um, I feel like even if it's not overt, there's still something there that needs to be worked through, whether it be a lack of wanting to take responsibility or sacrifice or different psychological factors like that. And I feel like often when I'm interacting with other people and parents, that psychological aspect seems so strong, in, even when it comes to the physical health, even when it comes to trying to discern what is physically healthy and trying to avoid chemicals. There's like that lack of wanting to take responsibility for the health of the family and the health of ourselves and education and all these other things as well. But even from a very physical level, it seems like that psychological aspect, that putting in the great work yourself, where we lack that as a foundation too.
Well, one way to look at this, Liev, is, you know, as a parent, you're going to be an example, right? No matter what you try to say to your child to, get them to behave a certain way or do a certain thing, they're going to be much more influenced by observing what you do. So, part of the preparation, in my opinion, before you have children is to begin improving yourself. And you can think about it, what is it about me that I would want to impart on my child and give that impression from how I act and the relationships I'm in? Like, of course, the father and mother's relationship is important, and with any other family members that are involved. And set that as a high standard to try to develop yourself. Now, you're not going to attain perfection, and you're going to make mistakes with your kids and act poorly in front of them, but it can always be remedied. And the important part is that you're aware of these things and you pay attention, you evaluate yourself, you're not afraid to apologize and or change course so that you can improve. And all the consensus opinion from the psychologists who looked at parenting and children and what is the magic recipe, for a successful child rearing. And it comes down to being a parent that's good enough. And, that means that you care and you put in the effort. And even if you make mistakes and have shortcomings and have limited resources, if those two things are there in substance, then you're gonna be okay.
Yeah, very well put. Yeah, yeah, that's a great magic recipe. It's inevitable that mistakes happen, right? So that's amazing. Um, so I'm kind of curious along the lines of childhood illness. That's something that is very prevalent in this day and age as well. It seems to be coming earlier and earlier, and there's all these different theories on how disease develops. And um, I'm really curious about your thoughts on these. Let's maybe begin with the more infectious side of things. Like, do we got to worry about the mumps and the measles and the rubellas and polios and chickenpox? What are your thoughts on the role that even maybe some of these play developmentally for our so-called immune system? Or maybe we'll start with the infectious side of things, and then it obviously ties into the more chronic side, but we'll start there.
Sure. Well, let me begin by saying that I've been really trying to understand what are the factors that lead to good health. And in doing that, it's very difficult to look at only modern experiments because everyone practically in the world now is living in the context of the Industrial Revolution. So the predominant, cultures and technologies have really influenced almost all people on the planet. There are very few kind of unspoiled people from the past. And I'm talking about, hunter-gatherer type societies, maybe with some limited agriculture, but not on a mass scale. But there's plenty of anthropological research on this topic. And if you look at some of those publications, and Daniel Roydus and I shared some material with each other on this topic. I know you've interviewed him as well. And it's fascinating because we see that in these cultures that lived a natural lifestyle, right? And their subsistence was based on hunting and gathering. They had really none of these diseases whatsoever. So they had no TB, they had no measles, they had no malaria. They also had no birth defects, no maternal mortality. So, mothers dying during childbirth. These things were unheard of. So, if we're going to ask this question, I think one of the starting points would be is, why do children in the modern era have these common illnesses? And really, colds and flu are the most common. And in these cultures I'm talking about, they didn't know what a cold was. And so why do they have these, experience them now and not then? And I think, one thing is, we don't have a definitive answer. There's no scientific experiment which proves the cause. We do have a lot of circumstantial and inferential evidence. And some of that is, kind of first principles, because what is the common thread of all of these, so-called infectious illnesses? And, of course, we could look at the etymology of infection as well, which, Sam Bailey has talked about. It is that something is always coming out of the body, right? So if it's one of these skin eruptions, then it's coming out through the skin, right? Like measles and chickenpox, you have the fluid that comes out into the vesicles, and then they rupture, and right, the fluid gets out of the body. You have the respiratory infection, where you have snot coming out and coughing up sputum. If it's the flu, sometimes it can also occur with vomiting and diarrhea. And then you have the GI, infections that are just vomiting and diarrhea. So in all those cases, stuff is coming out of the body. And when the body is purging stuff, that means there's things that are harmful it needs to get rid of. And, we know this from our own experience. For example, if we eat something, that's spoiled, like that has a poison in it, we're going to throw up and have diarrhea after that, right? Because our body's just trying to get rid of that poison. So most likely that's what's happening. And we can, of course, look at the influence of this sort of modern civilization. And, I don't want to say Western, because this occurs in the East as well. But even if we look back to those hunter-gatherer societies, we can see, because once the anthropologists came and the doctors to start studying their health, they also started to influence their culture and bring that, modern technological culture to those people. And what happened? They started developing the same diseases that they had in the West at that time, right? Like TB, colds, malaria, etc. Those were heretofore unknown among those people until this influence happened. So what is it about, the influence of that modern culture that brought these conditions about? And, what is it? It's processed food, right? It's, well, at that time, I'm not sure that there were really industrial chemicals, but if we look at their lifestyles of how there was piles of dung in the streets, and really poor air quality and crowded living conditions, lack of good nutrition, all these things, added up to express those types of illnesses. And I think one good way of trying to get at what's more specifically might be the cause, like what particular types of environmental conditions, would be to, take like the fluid from chickenpox, for example, and do a chemical analysis on it and see, are there environmental industrial chemicals that are in there? And then could those be the cause? Then you could do some experiments with animals where you expose them by natural routes to those chemicals and see if they develop similar conditions. And, of course, these experiments could have been done, with quote unquote viruses as well. But, of course, they were never shown to prove anything.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope that you guys are enjoying the episode so far. And if you are, you will love the Beyond Terrain Academy. I've taken everything that I've learned from studying the terrain, speaking with the greatest minds in the terrain field, and have distilled it down to the fundamentals, easily digestible content and material, as well as a place to go even deeper and more specific into the terrain as well. Becoming a full Academy member gives you access to monthly masterclasses, the Terrain Wellness Club, the Terrain Studies Library, Q&A and discussions, as well as deep dive classrooms in things like parasites, movement, terrain lifestyle factors, as well as a space for reflection. There is so much available in the Beyond Terrain Academy. And don't forget, you can pay for the entire year to gain access to that Catalyst consultation to launch you into your healing journey, as well as a year-end check-in to ensure that you've been putting into practice the terrain principles to keep you accountable. But let's get back to the episode.
Yeah, well put. So I'm curious, like on your read of the anthropological evidence, was there ever some sort of natural type of illness manifestation? Like some people say that the seasonal flu is kind of a natural thing. Every year it's natural to kind of detox, and you hear the as above so below argument. Well, the trees detox and they lose their leaves, and to me it doesn't strike me as necessarily absurd as that being kind of a natural part of our being, of the natural way of life. But I'm kind of curious on your thoughts. Is that a part of the natural progression of health and wellness?
Well, look, if our bodies do something spontaneously, it's by definition, it's natural because we are of nature, right? You know, I was quite surprised to learn that these cultures in North and South America, mostly is what I read about, had not experienced seasonal colds, and they were not all in tropical climates as well. So, I don't necessarily know the answer. Maybe uh, it's something that only comes about when the body needs it. I mean, the interesting thing, and you can actually see a video of this um, demonstrated in real cells in the lung, I believe, is that the cilia or the mucociliary clearance that occurs in our upper respiratory system, once the humidity is reduced, which happens every year in the fall and winter, um, it stops, like the cilia stop moving, they slow down, and stuff gets stuck there. And this was actually demonstrated in this video I'm talking about. You can see the particles not moving once the humidity is lowered, and it doesn't have to be lowered that much. So if there's a lot of particulate pollution that we're breathing in, and suddenly our respiratory system can't purge it out because this system is compromised because of a natural seasonal change, it makes sense that we manifest this type of illness or a healing crisis, if you will, where our body then can purge out that material. And if we look at what it is that we're breathing in the modern day, there's quite a lot of things, right? I mean, and it's different in indoor versus outdoor, but in both places, there are many particles of a variety of different materials and chemicals that you're breathing in. So, and it also depends on where you live. In fact, I'm not sure which government agency in the U.S. has this. It may be the EPA, but it could be something under the CDC as well. But they have a map of the entire nation and listing air quality issues related to factory emissions, like chemical factories and other factories that in their emissions have respiratory irritants or toxins. And you could see that quite a lot of the country is covered with these types of manufacturing facilities, and that many people among the population are directly affected with higher concentrations of these things that they're breathing in. So it's actually really a good thing that our body has a way to deal with this, because if these things accumulate in the body, they're going to bring about much more serious problems over time. And I think for many of the people in those areas, that their system becomes overwhelmed, and that's why you have higher rates of pulmonary disease and cancer in many of these areas.
Got it. Very interesting. Yeah, so it seems like on my kind of read of history, it seems as though chronic disease is certainly increasing, right? Like the rates are increasing quite a bit. It seems that acute illness maybe has been around kind of in the the Western literature for quite a long time, and maybe there were some sort of chronic quote unquote diseases, but within the last 100 years, 150 years, we've seen like a huge spike. And we've also seen a huge spike in the suppression of symptoms and the suppression of these acute illnesses, these acute symptoms. And as you're kind of alluding to here, it seems as though, if anything, they're helping us get rid of toxicity. I'm curious about your thoughts on that concept of the symptoms as being the cure, and then the suppression of that kind of leading towards some sort of chronic illness. I know the homotoxicology chart sort of talks about that a little bit, and we've alluded to that, but I'm not sure if you're too familiar with that. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, sure. Well, a couple things. So one is, I think there are some examples in certain populations of some chronic disease going back in history. And, we could think of actually ancient Egypt, where there's lots of depictions of people with, obesity, and they had a largely grain based diet, right? Really because of the agricultural revolution. And then we also have, more famously, the European aristocracy who ate lavishly and suffered from things like gout, arthritis, and such, right? That were really not known conditions. So there is some of that, but it's nowhere near what we have today. And in fact, if we just look, for example, at heart attacks. The first time heart attacks were reported in the medical literature in the United States was not until the early 1900s. So in other words, there weren't heart attacks before that, because that is not going to escape notice by the medical community. Or maybe there was 1 in a million people had a heart attack or something like that. But now it's one of the leading causes of death, right? So we created this and contributed to it in ways that we don't fully know yet, although there are many things we can implicate. So in terms of how to address your health, in my opinion, I prefer essentially following nature. So all of the kind of processes and materials would be, directly from nature with minimal processing, but, no machines or technology or synthetic chemicals, even if they're trying to mimic natural substances. In terms of the approach that I think is successful is to, identify the root cause of the issue and try to help your body mitigate that, because our bodies are always trying to heal, and if we're not healing or we're manifesting continuing problems, we're doing something to prevent our body from healing that we need to change. Now, what you mentioned about acute illness or kind of a healing crisis, I think that's usually happens early on when we're exposed to something that has a detrimental effect on our terrain, and our body is trying to quickly purge that. And sometimes, and if we suppress it, right, it's going to be manifest in a different way, and eventually in a worse way. And I think there's a nice little anecdote about that I heard somewhere, that someone overeats a bunch of junk food, and or maybe has some food poisoning, and they feel nauseated, but they try to suppress it because they really don't want to throw up. And then then they have the next day some diarrhea, but they take medicine to turn off the diarrhea. And so it's like your body keeps trying to express it, but if you keep suppressing it, then your body will just store the stuff somewhere, and eventually that's going to cause health problems, or more stuff will be stored there and it'll build up, and eventually it'll be heart disease or strokes or cancer or quote unquote autoimmune disease or something like that. The main strategy of the allopathic system with pharmaceuticals is to do exactly that, to suppress the symptoms at all costs, and or as I would describe it more accurately, turn off the healing. And then the problem is, not going to go away, and eventually it's going to turn into something worse. And this is why you see with all these drugs like monoclonal antibodies and such, and even chemotherapy agents, immunosuppressive agents, that they all have risks of various types of cancers. And I think that's probably the mechanism.
Interesting. Makes sense. Makes a lot of sense. It's one thing when you're sick and you're suffering and you could say, all right, I'm just going to let my symptoms kind of run their course. But then when it comes to seeing your child like sick and suffering and, sweating and vomiting, diarrhea, whatever it is, it kind of comes a little bit different, like, so then, is there a time and a place for some sort of kind of more natural or less invasive type of symptom suppression to kind of maybe slow things down while still supporting the body? Like, is that something that you ever consider?
So, no, I don't really think there's any appropriate time for symptom suppression per se. I mean, maybe if you have some gunshot wounds, you could take a few doses of morphine, but then cut it off.
Sure.
But
Fair
that's
enough.
about as much as I'm talking about, and that doesn't make the pain go away anyway. It just makes you care less about it. So, uh, what? So there's a lot of things. So first time parents, this is going to be the hardest for, right? Like yourself, because you're not going to have the experience to know that kids are really tough, and it takes a lot to actually, for them to be really sick, like emergency sick, but they can sometimes look like they're really sick. And so you have to, like, you know, take that under consideration and maybe have someone that you trust that you can, call for advice on this. And that could be, a medical person. I've certainly had this relationship with several young couples, some from, that I know from the community, and some of my consultation clients. And, certainly for my own, journey as a parent, I'm definitely the one to stay calm in these situations. Now, for a more detailed, discussion of what to do with certain situations and when it actually becomes dangerous, I have a free masterclass called "How to Avoid the Emergency Department," which speaks to that. You can find it on my website. We can get you a direct link if you want. And I talk about, things like fevers and febrile seizures, which is really a harmless thing. But so let's take that as an example, right? So now, what do they teach you, about fevers in the mainstream? Is that, well, it means you have an infection. It's dangerous because if it goes too high, you could have, fatal complications, right? That's kind of, and then the best thing to do is to take a drug like, an NSAID like ibuprofen or Tylenol, acetaminophen, to suppress the fever. Now, in reality, what is fever is a very powerful healing mechanism. One thing we know, sweating from several different studies allows your body to get rid of a lot of toxic things, including things like PFAS, the forever chemicals, certain heavy metals, BPA, right, plasticizing chemicals, and probably a whole host of other things that haven't even been tested for yet. And aside from that, heating things up in your body can denature various chemicals and proteins that could cause a deleterious effect. It also makes things more dissolvable or soluble, which makes things easier for your body to excrete. So there's a lot of benefits of fever. And, I look at it as an important healing process. So not something you want to suppress, but something you can help your body uh, do the function more efficiently, so that maybe it doesn't have to give you as many fevers or have the fevers as high as they would be otherwise. And that would be, things like enemas. So an enema can actually, will result in your body, the temperature coming down if you do it during a fever. And if you just do several, during the day, then you'll have fewer fevers because it provides an additional way for your body to get rid of that stuff. Also, now that might not be easy with all kids or depending on the age, but another thing would be to do, chelating or binding baths. So you use like a bentonite clay, like a cup and a half of clay, just to whisk it around in a bowl with a little bit of water first and then dump it in so it doesn't clump up. And it makes your skin feel great. It's kind of fun to watch the clay in the water. And that will also, it works through the skin just like the fever. So it'll help pull the toxins out through the skin, and help the body do what it's going to do. The only time that, you might want to get the body temperature down is, when it's really in a dangerous range, which is like 105 or higher. Now they'll say 104 or higher in most websites, but that they're trying to be more conservative because they want you to go to the hospital in that situation. But the fastest way to bring the body temperature down is wet blankets and a powerful fan. So all these things, you can be prepared for. I mean, most people have at least a fan in their house somewhere. They're not expensive. And everyone has blankets and a sink where you can get them wet. And you just put, wet sheet or blanket below and above the patient and blow the fan on them, and that'll cool them off super quick, even faster than in an ice bath, and be probably a little more comfortable for them. So so there's ways of just using, water is natural. A fan would be like the wind, so it's simulating the wind, but it's pretty natural. Evaporative cooling. Obviously, clay is dug up from the earth, right? Enema is just water up your butt. So all these things, are very doable, even if without technology.
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing. Amazing. No, that's really great. That's really helpful, and just rather than suppress, it's support. Kind of support your
Yes,
body and what it's trying to achieve, right? Like
exactly.
body's intelligent. I think that's one of the fundamental things that I'm sure you would agree that, I disagree with about the modern approach, right? Is that, our body's brilliant. It knows what to do, and supporting it rather than suppressing it, is the proper way to go about it. Um, on the topic of suppression, something that just popped into my mind is, a child who is like difficult, like tantrums or defiant or whatever it may be. And maybe this root's a little bit deeper, but are we supposed to suppress them psychologically when they want to scream and shout and, let it all out? Is that the adequate method of going about kind of the psychological side of these quote unquote symptoms?
Well, now this is an interesting topic, and I think you can look at this in a couple of ways. So one is, if a child is in an unstable or a hostile family or, parenting unit, then that behavior certainly can occur and it'll be worse. And so it's important to just, like say, is this a peaceful household? Does everyone generally get along? Is there, some degree of harmony and order? I mean, even things like, a really cluttered or dirty home, right, can result in behavioral outbursts.
Sure.
So, think about, and I think for most of the audience, I'm expecting that those are not issues, right? But it's just important to consider that. But it's, the other main issue are, the normal child development and then socialization. So, of course, you don't want your kid to go out in public and hit and bite people, right? No one wants that. But you also don't want your child to, develop a self-image that they're a bad person because they have the urge to do these things. So that's why you need to understand a little bit about child development. And, you don't have to study this at an academic level, because you can boil it down into some general principles. And some of these things you could just sort of think about, like, for example, when the you have a newborn, right? They're completely dependent. They can't even roll over, right? They can't do anything for themselves. And you are putting, all your effort to meeting every need. And if they can't clearly communicate until you learn, the baby language. So you're like trying everything under the sun, and they observe all this effort and swooning around them, and have this kind of worldview. I imagine, we can't interview a newborn to know for sure, but that the whole world revolves around them. So if that's true, then they would make all the rules. So if they think it would feel good to sink their teeth into your spongy flesh, why not? You're there to serve them anyway, right? So now, of course, you may not think about it that way in the moment when, they're putting their teeth on you, but that's probably close to where they're coming from. So you have to say, well, okay, if they're coming from that perspective, how do I explain this without shattering their world, and kind of letting them develop to the point where they understand the other versus the self, and that, not everything is about them, that there's other people involved too. And this, comes in with, saying please and thank you and apologizing, and all of this kind of behavior. Excuse me.
Sure.
So
No,
you need to put these things in the developmental context, and not sit, not think, oh, my kid is difficult or a bad kid, or like, use punishment per se. Now, of course, you have to also communicate at a level that they can understand. But my opinion on that is that you should talk to a child in a level above which they can immediately understand. And then one reason for that is that you probably underestimate what they can actually understand. And two is, you want to always show them that they should rise up to the level of, the people around them. And that they should, it's like they should always be striving to be a better man or woman throughout their life. Like, I don't think complacency is really a good human aspect. I think it leads to a lot of emotional turmoil. And so, of course, there's a lot of different, a lot of nuance and a lot of different things that can happen from child to child. But if you just think of those, principles about, how do I communicate effectively? How do I account for the child's developmental experience and the stage that they're at? And, teach them to properly socialize and, interact with others, and to, value learning, and to have, safe play and safe ways of getting their physical. And, that also involves giving them freedom and places where they can go a little bit more crazy without, having to have the boundaries as much. Right. But the boundary would more be like, oh, you're going to do that for a limited period of time, or you're going to do it only in this place. My young 2.5-year-old son loves to play ball. He loves to, throw balls, and he loves to hit balls like with a bat or a golf club. But of course, when he's swinging a bat or a golf club, it's like tempting to just swing it at anything, right? Including mommy and daddy, and the house, the walls, right? So having the limit, like, okay, you can hit with this, but you can only hit a ball, and kind of teaching that lesson. Or, we can play this, but only outside, right? Because if we throw the ball in the house, we'll break the chandelier or the vase or whatever. And so that you recognize, okay, they need to have, limitless, or, so you go outside, or you go to, some gym for kids, or other facility like that, where, that's what you're supposed to do. I mean, you don't want to, of course, be completely reckless, but the child, they'll know their own limitations. Can they handle something physically, and they push it a little bit, and, it'll be fine. So, and that's, another thing that in our current culture has really limited children's ability to develop, is this, sort of helicopter parenting. And, you know, it's important, I think, to give more freedom, autonomy, and responsibility to children at younger ages. And, this could be carried out a variety of ways, like, learning a trade or a craft where they can do independent projects, for example, like carpentry you mentioned before, because that's something, that kids could do at a pretty much younger than you might think they could do it. They might need to learn how to use the tools safely and such, but that's not going to be that difficult.
Sure, sure. Amazing. Something I wanted to ask about more specifically kind of popped in my head here was sleep training. Allowing, the kid to kind of cry themselves to sleep. I'm kind of curious about your thoughts on that philosophy.
Oh man, this is a controversial issue,
It certainly is.
and I don't know that there's any 100% right answer. There is one book that I do like because the techniques in there work, and the author gives you a lot of flexibility of, if you want to let them cry it out, or if you don't want to let them cry it out, here's a way to do it depending on what the preference, and here's, what are the differences and how it's going to work. And that's called Healthy Sleep Habits, Happy Child by Dr. I think Weisblut or Weisblatt. But, and then there's also, and I've done it with different children. I've done it different ways, like co-sleeping or not co-sleeping. When do you put the child in their own bed? What about the bedtime ritual, nighttime nursing? How do you get them to sleep through the night? Overall, the most important thing is that the child gets enough sleep, because, they grow in their sleep. They also consolidate learning in the sleep. So it's important that they get enough sleep. And it's also important that you as a parent get enough sleep, but you might have to compromise on how you get that sleep when you have a young baby, at least until these issues like sleeping through the night and such are worked out. And so if it's really disruptive and you want to be worked out as quickly as possible, you might take one path. And if you want to be more laissez-faire and flexible about it, you can take, a longer road. And I've done both with different kids. The important thing is that the child becomes able to self-soothe to sleep, because that's something that will impact their lifetime of sleeping.
Absolutely.
So, and of course, that is the natural thing for a child. So, it's not something that will be that hard to obtain, but there are some things that can interfere with it you want to be aware of. Some things, I never knew about can be detrimental, like actually having a nightlight on has a much higher incidence of children needing reading glasses. Yes. So better to sleep in, the full dark, or, moonlight only, which is, natural, I would say. So, there are certainly some things like that. I've always, really loved the bedtime ritual because, it's a real awesome chance to bond with your child. I've done tons of, reading books and, singing songs and things like that to help them, get into a state where they're ready to soothe themselves to sleep. And, so in other words, there's a lot of different ways. And with respect to the sleep deprivation, one thing is that, you need to expect that when you have a newborn starting right after the birth, your sleep is going to be different. For the nursing mom, it's really going to fall mostly on you unless you pump and bottle feed. And you may not, even if you're going to do that, you may not do it right away, because you're the only one who can meet the needs of the newborn. But if you just to kind of accept that and say, I'm going to sleep when the baby sleeps, you won't need to sleep as much as the baby. So you'll get enough sleep that way that you won't feel sleep deprived. Now your schedule is going to be all off and you're not going to feel perfect, but you'll feel way better than if you really were sleep deprived, like trying to just sleep during the normal nighttime hours and then end up that's when the baby gets up, and you have to be awake. So having some flexibility, and the dad can do that also once they're able to be, depending on how you do things, able to be involved in those wake ups, and you can negotiate between uh, yourselves in terms of what works with respect to your other obligations, if you're both working parents or that kind of thing.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's obviously a lot of controversy when it comes to different parenting styles in general and different approaches to homeschooling and what you should do about this and what you should do about that. And it kind of comes back to this original idea of, you know, learning yourself and making the right decisions for yourself and your family and doing your best. And inevitably we'll make mistakes, and trying different things here and there is going to be really helpful. There's a certain amount of scientific method that you can use with your own family, I suppose, in a way, right? Control different things and try different things out, and learn from others, and but at the end of the day, you kind of got to do what's best for you, right? And you got to.
Yeah, there's no single, parenting style that's superior, because we're all unique individual people, and we have different, cultures and values and such, and that's going to enter into our parenting. So I agree with you. Just go back to the basics. Do you care, and are you putting in the effort? And as long as you're continuing to have both those things, like you'll work it out.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Are there any like non-negotiables when it comes to child rearing, when it comes to their physical health or their mental health or whatever it may be? What are the things that stick out to you as like, there's no doubt about it, this is harmful, we shouldn't do this? I could think of a couple pretty
Well, I
clear ones.
mean, obviously, immunizations.
Yeah.
And by the way, all those, well baby visits are just about getting immunizations. They're not doing anything else. You can, weigh and measure the height at home if you think that's important, but you'll know if your, baby is not growing right,
Hmm.
so to
Yeah.
speak. And there's a lot of individual variation.
Yeah. And I remember talking to Dr. Mark Bailey about this, and I think he brought up Ivan Illich, who was an author and spoke about a little bit of this topic here, and how we over medicalize birth and even child development and child rearing. It's a natural process. It's not a disease. You don't need to necessarily monitor the weight. You'll, like you mentioned, if something's going to be off. Like consistently measuring things, it just gives us the reason to worry and want to seek, counsel with a practitioner. And it kind of just feeds this whole system of externalizing your own responsibility and sovereignty, like constantly looking at the weight and the height and the this and the that, and the going in for every cough and little skin rash or whatever it may be. And God forbid that happens, if you adhere to the natural principles. But, it all feeds this kind of system, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That is part of, the initiation ritual, if you will, or that's, you go and check those things, and something is always going to be slightly off, even though that it's just an anomaly, and then that keeps you coming back, and then they suggest more and more things, and you don't you're going to miss the important points with that. Like the Baileys were talking about that one of their children developed, an acute illness for the first time, and they hadn't been ill before. And then they remembered that they gave him or her some junk food. I think it was M&Ms specifically. And the timing was, M&Ms and then sick. So if you go to the doctor and, get some pills or whatever, they tell you it's a bug that's going around, then you're not going to think, oh yeah, well, my kid just went to a birthday party and, had sheet cake from the grocery store, and now they're sick, right? And then it's like, oh, we don't need any pills for that. This is good. This is like his, body's getting the toxins out, and we'll next time, think twice about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Amazing. Yeah, no, that's it. Then it comes back again, like these central concepts of responsibility and learning and educating oneself on the vast majority of the topics that we're talking about today, and so far beyond this as well. So I do really appreciate it. Is there anything, Dr. Kaufman, you'd like to leave the listener with?
Well, I think just to let you know that I have a number of workshops, some of them free and some of them for a nominal fee, teaching about all the principles of healing, of natural healing, with respect to all the various types of issues you could be dealing with. And also, I have a membership group called the True Living Fellowship, where we actually talk about these issues of family and parenting. We also go into relationships of various types, and because the mission of that is like, how do we take this knowledge of what is truthful and then actually implement it in our lives? And family, of course, is a big part of that. So if you want to get deeper into these subjects, I do offer a lot of resources that you could take advantage of.
Absolutely. You absolutely do. Well, I appreciate your work. I know we all appreciate it, and we appreciate your time for coming on here today, Dr. Kaufman. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
All right, you're welcome, and good to see you again.
Of course. Nice to see you too.
All right, and I want to thank you all so much for listening. Before we wrap it up, we all need to remember that this is for informational purposes only, and this does not constitute medical or therapeutic advice and will not replace the advice from a qualified practitioner. But also remember this, that we are sovereign beings capable of thinking, criticizing, and understanding absolutely anything. We are self-healers, self-teachers, self-governable, and so much more. And together with each other and the greater forces, we can regain our natural vitality, meaning, clarity, purpose, and health. I do really appreciate you all for taking the time to listen to the podcast today. If you want to support what we do, make sure to like, share, comment, subscribe, leave a rating or a review, and follow the show. Sharing is the extra step. Let a few people know about the podcast. And if you do want to go deeper and you do want to deeply support what we do here at Beyond Train, join the Beyond Train Academy. There is a ton of value in there available for you all. There is free resources as well, so do not miss out on those. If you have any questions, criticisms, comments, concerns, please reach out to me. Instagram is a great way to do that. Email works as well. But just remember, there are two types of people in the world: those who believe they can, those who believe they can't, and they are both correct. Thank you all for listening. Take care.